10 o'clock, and being respectful of everyone's time, I would like to call to order this meeting of the formal session of the Yamhill County Commissioners, February 2nd, 2017. And I'd like at this point in time, McKaylee, would you lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And this is a time we set aside for an invocation, and today we have Dave Adams has agreed to do our invocation. He is a licensed minister with the International Fellowship of Ministries. And so, David, if you would come forward, please, and do an invocation for us, I appreciate it.
Okay. Test one. Is it working?
That's working.
Okay. Let us pray. Lord, there's just so much that divides us across this country now. I just pray, Lord, as I was thinking about what to pray for. May we be a people, may we be the United States of America. May people across the planet see us as, even though we have differing opinions and different theories on how to govern people, may they see us come together for basic core principles: justice, mercy, compassion, and fairness, and justice and liberty. Lord, may all of that also filter down to the local city and county level. Lord, we just ask for wisdom. We ask for wisdom to govern fairly and justly. Lord, may we as a people look for ways that unite us as a people and as a city and as a county and as a country, instead of looking for ways to divide. Lord, we do have differences, and we do have things that come up in our lives that we need to make decisions. Lord, be in those decisions. Give us the wisdom, give us the grace, give us the compassion to govern fairly and justly and with love and compassion and grace. In the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, amen.
Amen. Thank you,
Dave.
This is a time we have set aside for a public comment on any item that is not currently on the agenda or is not a quasi-judicial matter. And I have no intent to speak cards at this time, so I will move on to the first item on our agenda, being our consent agenda. And do I hear a motion?
So moved.
It has been moved that we approve the consent agenda. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Hearing none, we will move to old business, and we have no old business, we have no other business, so we get to the reason most of us are here today, and that is our public hearing on docket, forcing me to go to my glasses. Docket FP-07-16KF, an appeal by Protect Grand Island Farms of the Planning Commission's approval of a request by Baker Rock Resources, Inc., floodplain development permit to allow mining on approximately 175 acres of property within the flood hazard overlay district. Applicant Baker Rock Resources, Inc., appellant Protect Grand Island Farms. So I will now open the public hearing, and I'm going to call for any abstentions on the part of my fellow board members. Are there any parties who have objection to the jurisdiction of the board in this matter? Hearing none, we'll read a statement as required by law, and County Council, would you please do that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Oregon law requires that persons who attend a land use hearing be advised of certain rights and duties before the hearing begins. First, with regards to the standards for approval, state law, Oregon 197.7635 requires that we list the applicable substantive criteria that must be met in order for the county to approve the application. The applicable standards will be listed by the county planner in a moment as part of the staff report. Testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed towards the standards for approval. Second, the raise it or waive it rule. Under Oregon law, any issue that might be raised in an appeal of the county's decision in this matter must be raised before the record of this hearing is closed. Failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the decision makers and the parties an opportunity to respond to the issue precludes appeal to the board based on that issue. Third, and this is directed to the applicant, under ORS 197.796, failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues relating to proposed conditions of approval, again with sufficient specificity to allow the county to respond to the issue, precludes an action for damages in civil court. One other item I might add, Mr. Chair, since this is not the initial evidentiary hearing, we are not required to agree to a request to extend, to keep the record open for another 7 days. If you get a motion and the board chooses to go ahead and extend the record for 7 days, you could do that. But since this is not the initial evidentiary hearing, that is not a statutory requirement.
Thank you.
And that if that request is made, it must be made prior to the time the chair announces the hearing is closed. Mr. Chair.
Very good. Do I have any statements of contact?
Right. Now would be the time if there had been any ex parte contacts that any of the board wanted to put on the record.
And maybe to note that you also did a site visit, I believe it was 10:30 on Monday, on the property.
Correct.
Yeah.
With that, the three of us did make a site visit along with the planning department touring the site, so we are aware of that. Also, I have my locksmith lives on Grand Island and came out, was doing some work at my house and started to get into discussion on this. It was of no other than the fact that he does have land there and that he was opposed to this when I told him I can't talk about it. So that is the length of that ex parte, but I did want to make that part of the record. So, okay, with that then, we will start what I'd like to do, and I did have a little trying to be prepared.
While you're looking for that, sir, would you like me to give the staff report?
That would be great. Thank you, Ken.
Yes, sir. The lot is approximately 224 and a half acres in size and is identified in the yellow outline behind me. The request is for a floodplain development permit to allow mining on approximately 175 acres within the floodplain overlay district. The access to the property is Upper Island Road, a paved county road. The property is Zone MR2, mineral resource, and contains flood hazard overlay. The property consists of open fields that have been in farm use. As to the surrounding area, the general area contains an extensive amount of high-value soils and is generally in large-scale intensive farm operations of 100 or more acres. Along the southwestern boundary of the parcel is a small day-use park area with a picnic area. Adjacent property is Zone EF80 and PRO, Parks, Recreation, and Open Space, and has the day-use picnic area operated and managed by the Oregon State Parks Department. As I know, the entire property is composed of Class 2 high-value farmland. However, as noted, the property has been rezoned to MR2 mineral resource. The Willamette is close by and is identified as fish habitat. The property is not identified in any county-adopted map as being in the Big Game Overlay District. The flood insurance rate map shows that nearly the entire parcel is within the 100-year floodway, and a small area that is outside of the floodway that makes up approximately 11 acres is located adjacent to Upper Island Road at the southern end of the property. The previous actions include finding by the county that this is a significant Goal 5 aggregate resource and a adoption of comprehensive plan amendment and a zoning amendment to mineral resource through that action. In that process, a limited use overlay zone was adopted on the property, which identified 30 conditions applied to the proposed mining operation. As noted in the exhibits, 3 separate ordinances have been applied to effect the above changes, and each ordinance was appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals and upheld by them. In these appeals and review by the Land Use Board of Appeals and Circuit Court, issues such as traffic, dust, noise, agricultural conflicts, etc., have been previously reviewed, and the sand and gravel activity is allowed within the parameters of the previous decisions. And these issues are not part of this application or the review criteria. This request was reviewed by the Planning Commission at their hearings on November 3rd and December 1st, and they voted 4-1 with 1 abstention to approve the application with 3 conditions. The request needs to satisfy sections 404 and 901 of the Yamhill County zoning ordinance, and specifically section 901.09B regarding the no net rise standard. I did note that there was a question about whether this needed a greenway permit. It came in yesterday. I did dig through the old greenway maps, and I found the 1974 era photos that the greenway was based on, and it shows the greenway boundary, and it shows the greenway boundary following the road. So I don't believe any of this property is within the Willamette River Greenway, and I did provide these maps to the applicant and the opponent, and I will pass those out now. Are there any questions?
Any questions? Okay, we have a lot of people here today who wish to testify. Now, I prefer not to place time limits on the testimony, but to do that, I need your cooperation. I'm going to provide first the proponents 30 minutes for their time to make their case, and then I'm going to allow the opponents 30 minutes for their case, and then we'll open it up to testimony from other members of the audience who wish to testify and have turned in a request to speak. I would ask that when you do that, if you are hearing comments that you were planning to make, that they were already made, please just tell us that you agree with the previous comments, because they are then part of the record. I don't want to cut anybody off or not allow somebody to speak, because you're here because you have a passion about this and we want to hear you, but we just also want to be respectful of everybody's time. Okay. So, any questions? Thank you very much for being here. And with that, I would ask that the applicants step forward to present their case.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I don't know how close I have to be to this thing. Let me know if it's not coming out right. My name is Phil Wiest. I'm an attorney at Black Helterline, LLP, 805 Southwest Broadway, Suite 1900, Portland, Oregon, 97205. I represent the applicant, Baker Rock. And as I'm going through this, please don't hesitate to interrupt if you have questions. I'm going to give a brief presentation, and then Mr. Lidstone, our expert, will go through the technical aspects of the floodplain development permit application. So the applicant is in for a floodplain development permit under Yamhill County zoning ordinance, Chapter 901. Yes. Is that better?
Yeah, directly into it as you can.
Okay. No, that's fine. The decision criteria are set forth in the staff report and the related material in the record. And the record in this matter, I think, is large, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,100 pages.
That was
from the
before
planning-
last night.
Pardon me?
That was before last night.
Before last night, I was going to
This
say
morning.
that. That was
Or this morning,
just from the
yes.
planning commission, and
Yeah.
it's been supplemented since then. So there's a significant amount of information in the record. I would note that the staff report identifies that there are no findings, no proposed findings for denial. And basically, the reason for that is that the decision before the board in this context is very narrow. It's just on the floodplain development permit. It's not on the quarry overall, which staff noted has been through an extensive Goal 5 process, 3 ordinances that have been appealed addressing all sorts of issues associated with a gravel quarry. And there are 30 conditions placed on those approvals that require the applicant to do and not do certain things and mitigate certain impacts associated with that activity. The decision before the board is really based on the approval criteria in section 90106 of the Yamhill County zoning ordinance. And the applicant is entitled to a decision on those criteria as they existed when they applied, and they haven't changed. Rather than stepping through all of the approval criteria, I want to just bring to the board's attention a few points, because we've previously addressed how in the application materials and in subsequent submittals to the Planning Commission, which are now in the record, and memoranda that were submitted on November 22nd, as well as the Lidstone report submitted in September of 2016. So I just want to hit a few points. One, Yamhill County Code doesn't prohibit development in the floodway, including the placement of fills or levees. And that's included, I've got an explanation of that in my November 22nd memorandum. The standard, the applicable standard is there a net rise in base flood elevation resulting from the proposed activity? And in this case, there's not. The standard in the code is that a professional engineer certifies that that's the case. And that report is included in the record as part of the application, and Mr. Lidstone will address that in more detail. A few other points I want to make that have been raised. I mean, a lot of issues have been raised on this that don't apply, that relate to the quarry operation on Grand Island, but don't relate to the decision before the board. So one is the FEMA biop, the biological opinion, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail about that because it's a complicated issue. But the fact is that it doesn't apply to the decision before the board. The Yamhill County Code, Chapter 901, implements the current floodplain development regulations for the county, and that is the applicable regulation. I have a more detailed explanation of that in my November 22 letter. Chapter 90107F applies to placement of levees and fills in the flood fringe area, not the floodway area. The flood fringe area has a separate standard. Flood fringe area says you can't have more than 1 foot rise. When you do development, when you're looking for a floodplain development permit in the flood fringe area, the standard is no more than 1 foot rise in the base flood elevation, right? So when you're doing fills and levees, 901F applies to that flood fringe, not in the floodway. In the floodway, there's a more restrictive criterion, and that is no rise, no net rise in the base flood elevation. So 901.07F doesn't apply. Again, I've got a more detailed explanation in my November 22 memo. Next, the applicant is still required, under the terms of the prior approvals, the prior three ordinances, 865, 873, and 879, and under the Planning Commission decision on the floodplain development permit, the applicant is still required to obtain all other approvals, all of their necessary approvals, state approvals, federal approvals, and the applicant recognizes that. There may be a Corps of Engineers permit. There's certainly the Dogami operating permit. All of those processes are ongoing, and we're pursuing those, and there's going to be an opportunity to address any issues that arise in the context of those permitting processes as we go through them. But the decision before the county today is really just based on the criterion in 901.09, which is there any net rise in the base flood elevation as determined by a professional engineer or as certified by a professional engineer. There's also a letter dated December 30th from the National Marine Fisheries Service that was written to Dogami in response to Dogami basically sent out a letter to the agencies about the application for the Baker Rock Quarry on Grand Island, and the National Marine Fisheries Service responded with a letter saying that it had some concerns about the quarry activity in that location. That letter does not speak at all to the criterion that's applicable in this decision before the board today. It talks about matters that are outside. It talks about matters that were addressed through the prior permitting processes, and also about matters that are going to be addressed through the Dogami operating permit and the Section 404 Corps permit process, and those issues will all be addressed. But it doesn't speak at all to what's before the board today. I think it is worth mentioning in that letter, and I don't think we need to go into detail because it's not before the board, but the jurisdiction proposed by the National Marine Fisheries Service in that letter suggests that NMFS has direct jurisdiction over every area in Yamhill County that's in the floodplain, meaning that any farming activity that's in the floodplain, any activity in the floodplain, is directly regulated under the ESA. And just as an editorial comment, that's a very broad assertion of authority that could have wide-ranging impacts for Yamhill County. So it's something to look for in the future. It's not part of today's hearing, but that letter has some issues in it that I think will come back that the Yamhill County Commission will have to consider as it looks at its floodplain development permit ordinance through the process that the BIOP is going to bring about. So in summary, Yamhill County has approved the land use, the quarry use, in 3 separate actions. That's not before the board. All that's before the board today is whether the proposed activity meets the criteria in the Yamhill County zoning ordinance for a floodplain development permit. All of the information submitted by the applicant in the record and testimony and additional information submitted through the Planning Commission process establishes that they meet all the criteria for that permit. And the report submitted by Lidstone and Associates is unrebutted in the record, and so the applicant has clearly met its burden of proof. And staff recommended approval, the Planning Commission recommended approval. We respectfully request that the board do the same. I'm going to ask Mr. Lidstone to run through the technical bases of his finding that there's no net rise in the base flood elevation, and he'll provide also a little history on the background about the prior Goal 5 process.
Thank you very much. Can you hear okay?
Yeah.
All right, great.
Thank you.
My name is Chris Lidstone, and I am principal of Lidstone and Associates, and we've been actually working this project in particular since 2007. And to give you a little bit about my background is I went to high school in Massachusetts. I went to college and got a degree in geology and geophysics at Cornell University in upstate New York. Got my master's degree in fluvial geomorphology, which is study of rivers and river mechanics, hydraulics, and sediment transport from Colorado State University. And then I began, as a firm, we began working in the state of Oregon in 1988. And since then, I've been involved with multiple counties, multiple river systems throughout the state of Oregon. Within my company, we've got licensed geologists, licensed engineers, all who've worked licensed within the state of Oregon. So that's basically my background. As I do my presentation, feel free to interrupt it. I'm happy to address your questions. You're going to be hearing a lot of information potentially today from the opponents. We've gone through, and the record reflects my rebuttal to much of that testimony. There may be some more new information today I don't know about, and I'm happy to try to address those questions too. So, very briefly, I think Phil has addressed what's in front of you. I think it's very important to say that a lot of the issues that I've rebutted in the floodplain development permit issue have been related to issues that were raised and brought up during the Goal 5 presentations. And I feel very comfortable that Yamhill County has addressed many of those issues. But again, as I'm more than happy to talk about those further today. This is a picture of the site during a flooding event. This reflects something, you start talking about return periods and flooding, you start talking about things like the 2-year event. This is very close to a 2-year flood event, which basicwilly shows the Willamette River backing in to the site, the river's flowing to the north, backing in through, you'll hear some discussions on Skeeter Creek and Skeeter Slough, and the water backs into the site in this sort of fashion. Typically, when I am involved with a mining or a mine plan site, our goal is to evaluate the existing system and try to develop a development plan that allows you to be concurrent with and to conform to the behavior of the river system. So what we addressed in the Baker Rock permit application to Dogami and in the Goal 5 presentation to the county was flooding, the potential for river channel changes, which is river avulsion, accretionary changes, which is a river actually eroding the banks and eroding into the site, groundwater issues, and water quality issues. We have a very extensive document that's part of the record that addresses all those issues and multiple testimonies and so forth over the years. Specifically and very importantly is within the mining planning process, all of the mining and all of the mine plan will essentially avoid all the riparian areas. We are offsetting the sloughs, we're offsetting the vegetated areas. We've proposed, and it's in front of Dogami, that there's a minimum of a 350-foot setback to the Willamette River. And that's really designed, A, to protect the riparian area or the greenbelt area, but also more importantly, it's to make sure that what vegetation is there will be there as a buffer between the operation and the river. The other thing you may hear today is that there's potential for Baker Rock to impact areas that are not within this mine permit area, and that's not the case. There will be no reconstruction of Skeeter Creek. There'll be no excavation, there's going to be no cleaning it out, there's no lowering of the road, nothing of that nature. Grand Island Road will remain the same. So the way that the river floods the site won't change. It's anticipated that it's the case. The mine plan is such that during the high water periods, all mining is wet mining. So you don't have this potential where the river, when it floods in, it drops into a dry pit and erodes backwards. That is historically been, when you have even considered issues from a hydraulic standpoint, that's a concern with any mining operation, is having water jump into a dry pit. This system, the design, the anticipation, the permitted plan will not allow that to happen. The issue of contemporaneous reclamation is an important thing to consider, which essentially means that they're mining in cells, and as they mine that's already been mined. And so you basically, as you mine progressively, you're reclaiming progressively. So it's not like you have one large open disturbed mine area. Is this mining process, which takes place over a 30-year period, is mining and reclamation, mining and reclamation. And then basically as you put the overburden back in the cell, then you also put topsoil over the top of that overburden, and you try to get vegetation established immediately. In fact, Baker Rock has already gone out there and done some vegetation in areas where there's scant or less issues of any impacts that the dewatering that takes place during the summer months. They've got that water not being discharged to the river, but it's being discharged to an infiltration trench, which separates the mining operation from any area wells. That basically serves as a mounting ability of actually putting the water back into the ground and mounting. There are issues associated, questions raised about water quality. Well, from a standpoint of water quality, the whole mining operation, by putting the water back into the ground actually serves as, just like McMinnville's water system, you have a slow sand filter. Essentially that water passes through sands and gravels, and if it were turbid or dirty in any way, shape, or form, it would be basically filtered out through the aquifer itself. So these are important considerations that went into the application. These are questions that were addressed during the Goal 5 process. The reclamation plan, the goal here was to develop a reclamation habitat using native plants and vegetation, and we have a very extensive portion of the Dogami application in the Goal 5 approval that addressed the reclamation plan. The idea is to improve some wetlands and to look at both subemergent and upland species. So that was a critical aspect of the overall reclamation plan. You'll probably hear some issues about the potential for a channel change and avulsion. As part of this program, we looked at 70 years worth of aerial photography and actually 150 some odd years of GLO maps and planning to see what the channel changes have been to ensure that we aren't in a situation where the river's going to want to change and move towards this operation. This map that you're looking at here reflects how the river system has changed over time. And essentially, the movement of the river has actually been away from the site. The area that we call Skeeter Creek or Lambert Slough was an active channel back in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. But the river abandoned that channel years ago. The current loop that you see that's on this map here that you can see in red in red and orange, was actually an active channel in the 1920s. That channel cut off, and I think in 1929, and then the channel's been moving basically away from the site since that point in time. So this kind of gives you an idea of the geomorphology. What's interesting as things have moved is you can actually see that there's actually an old mine pit on the other side of the river that's been there that doesn't have a 375-foot or 350-foot setback. So you do have a system here that, and like any river system, the Willamette River, which I've been working with for 30, 40 years of my professional career, is a dynamic system. I worked with Yamhill County actually on a study and with Dogami and so forth, and essentially it's a dynamic system. We know it's a dynamic system, and we are looking at it to make sure that our plan, our program, our mining will not accelerate channel change. This just gives you a brief idea of the Corps of Engineers navigation charts. This is their response to the system. This is where they have put revetment in, and this is really nothing more than to characterize from your standpoint, what's out there today. Now we kind of get to the issues associated with the actual county hearing today, which is really the nature of the floodplain development permit. This is what we call our hydrology and hydraulics. My firm used a model called HEC-RAS. That's the same model that's the Yamhill County firm panel flood insurance rate map used. FEMA uses. It is the acceptable model by FEMA as a governmental agency. It's a one-dimensional hydraulic model. It looks at the surface water elevations. It looks at the characteristics of the channel. It looks at, you can put in different flows and so forth. So my firm used the same model. More importantly is whenever you're doing a floodplain development permit, you really need to use the same cross-sections that Yamhill County used, the same spacing, the same orientation, because essentially you're looking at a regulatory floodplain or floodway within Yamhill County, and you're looking at what is the impact of this proposed development on that water surface elevation. So that's key part of the code, key part of the modeling effort. And so my firm looked at and brought in those cross-sections from Yamhill County, from FEMA, to make it more sensitive to the channel changes that were being proposed as part of the Baker Rock operation. We took those 9 Yamhill County cross-sections and we added 9 additional cross-sections, similar length, similar orientation, to really characterize the potential channel changes in the floodplain. We use the base flood flow, which in this case is a 100-year event, which is 255,000 cubic feet per second. To give you a little framework of that, the 1996 flood was 200,000 cubic feet per second. The 1964 flood was about 300,000 cubic feet per second. So that's the nature of this 100-year event that was brought in. We brought in that information, and the next step really for us was, and I'm actually showing the setback again, but the next step was to look at what's called a duplicate deck, to show that our model repeats with no changes whatsoever. Our model repeats the same thing that the Yamhill County model does. So we take the Yamhill County data, we put it into our computer, and we create this called duplicate effective deck. And this table here identifies, as part of the application went to Yamhill County Planning, it basically shows that our model replicates the county's model in a very reasonable fashion. The next step for us is to look at worst-case conditions, which in the case of our proposed development operation, there are two time frames to be considered. One is when there are some berms being built, processed water berms being built, nearby a processed water pond. And that occurs in the first 10 years of the mining operation. And the least amount of new ground is open, and we've got these 2 and 3 foot high berms around a pond. Bearing in mind that both the Goal 5 hearing and Baker Rock have conditioned and have committed that there will be no stockpiles on site during the winter months. All material is being removed, or in the case of, let's talk about this contemporaneous reclamation, it's being backfilled back into these lowered areas. So the first interim conditions was the first one, my slide's a little bit out of order, was this processed water pond. And we, the engineers, made the determination based on the model by putting in these berms that there was no net rise. And as Phil pointed out, is because we're working within the floodway, not the floodplain, we're allowed to have no net rise. And so essentially, we had a system where you could build the berms, and the impact during those early years would be no net rise. Going back to the noise berm, and you'll hear some discussion on the noise berm, which is greatly discussed during the process of the Goal 5 hearing. We have a noise berm on the northern part of the site, northwestern part of the site, which is designed to ensure that there is no impact of the noise from the mining operation on neighboring homes and houses. It's an articulated berm, which means it's not a continuous berm, but it's broken up so that floodwaters that back into the site can work their way through, so it's not diverting these waters around. Essentially, we modeled in that, we did model in that noise berm, and bearing in mind the way the permit is written is the process water system is gone by the time the noise berm is being constructed. They are not being built at the same time. And the long-term goal for Baker Rock is never to build the noise berm, because we're hoping that 20 years from now there's going to be technology available that doesn't require noise berms and sounds. But just to make sure, we modeled this worst case condition. And again, from a modeling perspective, there is no net rise. Lastly, our concerns were reclamation. What happens at the end of mining, and all we're dealing with is a reclaimed hydraulic condition. And again, is the information and the modeled information shows that there is no net rise. There's an overall lowering of the water surface elevation, as you can see from this particular table. And again, that's because there's actually a lowering of the ground surface associated with this pond. So in conclusion, and I know we've got a very short period of time, is my firm used the FEMA acceptable model. We use the same model as was used by Yamhill County in the firm maps. In fact, the date of that mapping was March 2nd of 2010. We used the Yamhill County cross-sections, same length, same orientation. We actually added cross-sectional data to show a better model. We used the firm 100-year hydrology. We successfully duplicated the two decks, so we have a good deck. We actually took it a step further, and we actually calibrated our model to lower flow conditions. We did sensitivity analysis, because when you get into modeling, a model is not worth anything unless it's actually calibrated to what's actually happening in the field. We had photographs like that first photo I showed you, which you could see where the water was at March 2nd of 1969 when that photo was taken. You can look at it and see what the water surface elevation was based on topography, and make sure that when you put that same flow into the model, it actually replicates that flow. We looked at it where we knew channel velocities at gauging stations. So we went through sensitivity analysis on that. There's another factor called Manning's End. We looked at some adjustments on that to see what would happen if the grass was cut short versus long and so forth. And so we not only went to the nature of what the rule required, but we went beyond that to make sure we had a representative computer model that showed what was going on. And again, our conclusions were that mining is occurring within the floodway, not the flood fringe, and that there is no net rise for the 100-year water surface elevation. Finally, in my last just set of conclusions, which is more of a repeat of the Goal 5, but a lot of these issues were raised during the planning and zoning hearing, which is why I'm bringing it forth today, was we did a very extensive analysis both for Yamhill County as well as Dogami, and that there, from a geomorphic standpoint, there will be no mining will not result in a channel change. The flood flow paths will continue the same. The water will still go up the slough. We aren't affecting the slough, so people that live on the slough or have water rights on the slough will not be affected by anything that is happening within the mining operation. We do, and you'll be hearing some discussion today about a fish channel. Under Section 7 of ESA, there's issues with the potential for fish entrapment, and I think this is what Phil referenced on this whole issue in the biological opinion and so forth in the floodplain, is if fish get captured by a pond, be that a farmer's pond, be that a field and so forth, there's a potential fish entrapment issue. So as part of this, in the early 2000s, Dogami started to recommend fish channels that actually allow fish to basically work their way from an off-channel source into the mining operation and can also leave it. Bearing in mind that the way these fish channels, the way this fish channel works is there's a gated culvert, so if they're actually mining and you create dirty water, you keep that water retained so it's not discharging to the river. But if an overtopping event comes in, Baker Rock ceases mining where the area has been overtopped because you don't want to have any impact to those fish. And then during the winter months, there is a way for the fish to actually return back to the river until the system is cut off, generally on June 1st of every year. Again, there are no changes to Skeeter Creek, no impact to the groundwater wells. We've addressed noise impact and dust and airborne particulates. Our overbank average velocities within this mining area in the event of a flood are very low. We looked at the 10-year event, which is kind of more of the worst case event from a velocity standpoint. And those velocities stay on the average at about 2.4 feet per second. And at the 100-year event, on the average, they're about 3.8 feet per second. That doesn't mean that every spot within the area will have those velocities. These are the average velocities across the area. But Also bear in mind that nothing that Baker Rock is doing is going to change the Upper Loop Road and so forth. Those are all basically staying at the elevations that the county has them at right now. And then finally, the mine and the reclamation plan will not result in any redirections of flow. So I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Okay.
Yes.
I have two questions. Your statement recently about Baker Rock would cease mining in the event of a flood concern. Does that mean cease mining permanently or just until the event had subsided?
Let me clarify that, Commissioner Sterrett. What I was talking about was on the fish channel issue, I think is what we're referring to, is if you go back to the map where they are mining on a cell-by-cell basis, bearing in mind if you were mining in this area around 6, 7, and 8, potentially these areas would be unmined. They may be stripped. So if the water were to overtop into this area here, the fish potentially could be trapped, could be in this area here. So no, they would continue to mine, but they would not mine in an area that was potentially impacted with the fish. And then once the fish returned back to the river, they could commence back in and finish mining and reclaiming those particular cells. So it would not be a cessation of mining. It would be just a suspension of mining during that period, during the high water period. So.
And also on page 4, where you, can you explain where it talks about under the technical analysis of the fluvial geomorphology, you talk about the core revetment has influenced morphology. What does that mean exactly?
Okay, these are the core revetments that are present here, and these have been built over the course of I think the Rivers and Harbors Act was 1948, and the Corps began building revetments. Back in the 1850s, Grand Island was truly an island, and the Corps, as you can see, they actually built a revetment at this location here to kind of cut off potential flow through there. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is, and this was very much part of the study I did for Yamhill County, was the Corps has influenced the whole system over the years. If you look at a map like this, Commissioner Sterrett, you can see these were old meanders. At one point in time, and you'll hear this in testimony, the river's been all across the Willamette Valley. And a natural process for a river is to, we have an original meander that was active in 1929, and the river, after a big flood, cut across and straightened that river. Those are the natural processes that we consider. So yeah, the Corps has influenced this, and that's also got to be a consideration that we have to look at from both a hydraulic and sediment transport standpoint. Having dams and reservoirs and water releases influences the hydrology of the whole system. And these are all core dams and so forth that are upstream in the Willamette River Basin. So as they change their water release schedule, that influences the behavior of the system. Suddenly you have more sustained lower flows. Back in Lewis and Clark were here, the whole system was probably much more complex a river. As we've developed cities and we've built protected farmland and so forth, we've actually eliminated a lot of that complexity. And there's a few papers right now addressing that particular issue, which is, does that affect some of the fish habitat, is having, all these old channels that were there were available for fish refuge, and they're no longer available because of the fact that the farmers may have levied an area here to protect their farmland, or you're protecting a road or a bridge or something like that. One of the advantages in mining and the mining aspect that's been written in the recent record has been that by working within these floodplains, you're actually providing more complexity, and you're returning some of that complexity that existed prior to the move into the 20th century.
Thank you.
Are there no further questions then? No questions. Okay. With that, I thank you very much, and I would ask the opponents now to take time to present their statements and their materials.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Sid, could you excuse me just a second? I've had a request from one of my fellow commissioners. Can we take a 3-minute break?
Stand up and stretch. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Are you my timekeeper?
Usually Ken likes to handle it when they're in the planning department.
I better look
So
to Ken,
if you want
'cause-
him to do something for you, you better talk to him.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to do it now because that was my
Yeah.
I usually don't, Ken doesn't like me
Okay, just for clarification's sake, so I know, I was handed a stack of intent to speak cards and given a note, kind of an order of, was that an order of presentation? And is this as a block? So I know we allowed a little extra time, and I intend to do that for your side also. Is that going to be confined within all of these, or how do you want me to do this?
Well, actually, that 30 minutes would go basically through Mary Alderton's, and
Okay.
all the way through Katie, and then the rest of us would be just
Individual. Okay, I just so I'm not
Yeah.
under any, okay,
Yeah, yeah.
I appreciate it.
So the first 4 people would take the 30.
Okay, fine. Thank you. So then, I'm not gonna, I will call you Sid rather than Mariel, so go ahead.
Commissioners, for the record, Sid Friedman, Friends of Yamhill County, Post Office Box 1083. Is my volume fine?
Works for me.
Works for
Okay,
me.
everybody.
So
Thank you.
this floodplain development permit allows mining, filling, and grading on 175 acres of prime farmland on Grand Island. And like all of the island, the subject property frequently floods. The proposed site is not only within the floodplain, it is also within the floodway. Flood flows regularly and completely inundate the site during high water by up to 12 feet of water during run-of-the-mill 10-year flood events. The Board of Commissioners can and should deny this application for at least 2 legal reasons: the fill material that will be placed in the floodway and the incomplete and premature nature of the application. The applicant proposes the placement of fill within the floodway, including 2,000 feet of berms up to 18 feet high. And in addition, the applicant proposes additional fill in the floodway in the form of massive amounts of stockpiled aggregate. As the planning director acknowledged in his recommendation to the Planning Commission, these fills seemingly violate the explicit prohibitions in Section 90107F of the Yamhill County Code. And they state, no fill or levee shall extend into a floodway area. Any fill or levee must be no greater than is necessary. Any fill or levee shall be protected against erosion, and no fill or levee shall cause additional floodwaters on adjacent land. To date, no party has claimed that the floodplain application complies with these criteria. Instead, the applicant and the county have relied upon a code interpretation by a prior Board of Commissioners that these criteria only apply to fills and levees that are partially within the floodway and partially within the flood fringe, not to fill or levees that are wholly within the floodway. And that prior interpretation was made in response to a remand from LUBA directing the county to interpret its own code. On further review, LUBA found the county's interpretation to be plausible, and therefore it deferred to the county's interpretation. But that prior board's interpretation has no binding effect on the current board. We urge that you interpret the ordinance for yourselves and make the even more plausible interpretation that no fill or levee shall extend into a floodway area means no fill or levees in a floodway area. And that when the ordinance says no fill or levee shall cause additional floodwaters on adjacent land, it doesn't include a loophole for fills or levees that are wholly within the floodway. Turning to the incomplete and premature nature of the application, perhaps the kindest phrase would be to say that the application is extremely premature. The record contains a letter authored by ODFW validating and amplifying these concerns. The ODFW letter calls into question the final reclamation plan in the application, stating that much less open water may be necessary. And until there is a settled reclamation plan, there cannot possibly be adequate modeling to support the applicant's conclusions regarding no net rise after reclamation. In addition, the Planning Commission hearing brought out the lack of hydraulic modeling or other information on the fish channel. It also turns out that the fish channel, which is labeled as a concept in the application, is only one of 3 options under consideration. The ODFW letter validates our concern and states that ODFW will need site-specific information and hydraulic modeling on the fish channel. As with the uncertain reclamation plan, until the location and design of the fish channel is identified with certainty and the applicant provides information on its hydraulic impacts, they cannot reach supportable conclusions regarding floodwater elevation and velocity and erosive impacts, and cannot carry their burden of proof with respect to the corresponding ordinance criteria. So it's really common sense. As Planning Commissioner Dan Armstrong said before his no vote, you put a big hole in front of a big river and that's not going to work out well. Both ODFW and NOAA have raised red flags and warnings. The ordinance says no fill shall extend into the floodway, yet this application proposes massive amounts of the fill in the floodway. The current board can and should interpret the floodplain ordinance for yourselves, and you have the legal authority to do so. Regardless, the applicant has the burden to prove with substantial evidence in the record that all criteria are met, and they have not met that burden. For these reasons, we respectfully request that the application be denied, and you would be on firm legal grounds to do so. In addition, Mariel Darzan had hoped to drive over from Bend to testify in person. She's a staff attorney with 1,000 friends. She was unable to do so because of the weather conditions in the past. She asked me to make a few quick points for her, and with your indulgence, I'll do that. First, this application is premature. Per county and federal law, Baker Rock should have all required federal and state permits before obtaining this floodplain permit. They don't have those permits. Instead, they are under review by multiple state and federal agencies. 2, a floodplain permit is only good for 180 days. It is highly unlikely, if not impossible, that Baker Rock will have all their permits within 180 days, so they will have to get an extension or reapply anyway. Instead, the county should deny and require the applicant to reapply when they have all their necessary permits and all FEMA and ESA issues have been resolved. The county should be aware that the applicant is likely making this application now to avoid having to comply with the new FEMA biological opinion and the upcoming changes to rules that come with that opinion. And those rules are taking effect now. The county should be forward-thinking and apply the requirements in the biological opinion now to avoid potential issues later. 4th, the applicant should be required to finalize its plans relating to the fish channel because that issue directly implicates changes to the floodplain. Apparently, they have changed the location of the fish channel since the zone change and conditional use approval. But the fish channel location and construction was tied to that original approval, and that locational issue needs to be finalized before any more approvals are granted. It is questionable whether they are even allowed to change the location now, given that the fish channel and its location was a condition of the previous approval. 5th, the county has an opportunity to work with the federal and state agencies to make sure that the applicant will be in compliance. By approving this application now, without assurances that the applicant can get these applicable approvals, the county is putting the cart before the horse and putting itself at risk under federal law unnecessarily. So that concludes Mariel's remarks. We'd like to ask that the record remain open for 7 days so we can address new information that came in today, including the Willamette Greenway map that Ken handed out. And unless you have questions, that concludes what I have to say.
Commissioner?
No, thank you.
Not at this
Thank
time.
you, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
I guess I do have a question for staff, though. Maybe this is directed to Ken, what I've been reading and learning about FEMA's buyout process for the National Flood Insurance Program, they recommended that counties start looking at implementing those rules right now. It's my understanding from the last education system I was through that they haven't actually distributed the rules or the guidelines yet
That's
for implementation.
Yeah, I believe that those are expected to be out, I'm going by recollection, but I believe that's next year, early next year is when they anticipate those coming out. They have some early recommendations, but
But they're not actually the guidelines themselves. Okay, thanks, Ken.
Well, just an addition to that buyout, there's been a lot of, it's been compared to that Waters of the U.S.
Modus.
in that there's been a lot of concern by the counties as to whether or not this would be kind of be onerous conditions for developments and things, so I think it's still
Very
out
much
there.
up in the air.
I do too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sid. Okay. With that, if I'm clear on the order of things, and I may ask for some assistance here, we now, this time we give the proponents an opportunity to address, or is this when we ask for the public
there's some
testimony?
more. We would do the rest of the opponent's testimony.
Just wanted to get that point of order.
Then we have
Okay.
public agencies and then rebuttal.
So, Sid has spoken. We will start then with Ken Poon. Thank you, sir. If you'd state your name and address for the record, and as I asked earlier, contain your remarks as much as possible for the sake of time. So,
Sure.
thank you.
I'll do that. My name is Ken Pune. Live at 3320 Northwest Deer Run Street, Corvallis, Oregon. I'm a hydraulic engineer with West Consultants out of Salem, Oregon. Okay, so I'd like to state I'm a registered professional civil engineer in the state of Oregon. I'm a certified floodplain manager, and I have about 15 years of experience working in floodplain hydraulics, in particular FEMA floodplain studies, no-rise permits, FEMA floodplain permit reviews. I'm also an instructor for the American Society of Civil Engineers. I teach other engineers how to use the HEC RAS model that was discussed earlier and how to apply that to plain hydraulics. So I was asked by the Protect Grand Island Farms Group to conduct a review of the floodplain permit, and in particular the hydraulic modeling that was conducted by Lidstone and Associates in support of that project. And I wanted to talk today just about a few main points that I have based on my review of that permit. Before I get started with those points, I would like to just touch a little bit on terminology. I will keep it brief. We've heard mention of things like the floodplain and the floodway, and I feel like we just need to clarify a few things because it's important to some of my review comments. So this is the project site here, Grand Island. The actual permit is for the area outlined in purple, and that is located in the 100-year floodplain. And specifically, thank you. Specifically, that's located in what's called the regulatory floodway. So when we talk about the FEMA floodplain, that is the 100-year floodplain, and in this case, that covers everything in blue on that map. That includes the solid blue on the left and the right, as well as the hatched blue area in the center. Now, the FEMA floodplain is divided into two main components, the floodway and the floodway fringe. Now, what you can see here is, my pointer, there's a bunch of black lines along this figure, and I apologize if they're a little difficult to read. Mr. Lidstone kind of pointed these out. These are model cross-sections, and this is basically where we have data that was entered into a hydraulic model, and then where we can also obtain results from that model. It can tell us information about what the elevation of the floodplain is, how deep are the floodwaters, how fast are they flowing, things like that. So if we were to just pick any one of these lines and cut that cross-section through the existing topography of the ground, it might look something like this. This is a very simplified example, basically kind of a textbook example, if you will. And then in the model, we would put a certain discharge. In this case, we call it the base flood discharge. This is the 100-year flow that FEMA is interested in modeling to develop these maps. And what we have is this would be representative of the channel itself. To the left, this would be the left overbank. It's basically the floodplain. And to the right, that would be the right overbank, also the floodplain. And the elevation of that blue line would be the 100-year flood elevation. From that, we can create maps, and that's where these FEMA firm panels come from, basically. Now, the next part of the analysis is determining the boundaries for that floodway. That's the hatched area in the center of the floodplain. And the way you do that when you're modeling is at each cross-section, we basically squeeze the floodplain. And what that's representing is fill that may have been placed in the periphery of the floodplain. That represents people building houses, putting in fill, elevating their structures above the 100-year floodplain. And so FEMA allows you to squeeze, squeeze, squeeze at each cross-section until such time as the water surface for that 100-year flood goes up to a maximum of 1 foot. So there's the base flood elevation, and then there is a floodway elevation, which can be up to a foot deeper. And in fact, when people build houses in the floodplain or other structures in the fringe where they're allowed to do so, they have to elevate not just to the 100-year elevation, but a foot higher. The idea being that in the future, when this is all filled in, we could have a floodplain that's up to a foot higher than what the base flood shows. And that's basically, so this dividing line between the brown and the blue, that's the dividing line on that prior map I showed you between the hatched area and the solid area. And what that represents, the floodway fringe is where floodplain development is more readily allowed. People can bring in fill, build structures. The floodway in the center here is generally an area that FEMA heavily discourages development. The idea is that we recognize people need to develop in the floodplain to some extent to use their property, but we need to maintain conveyance for flood flows into the future. We don't want to put a bunch of obstructions in the floodway. And also, typically the floodway is considered kind of a higher risk zone because it's closer to the channel, higher velocities, deeper flood depths, things of that nature. Typically the velocities and the depths kind of decrease as you get to the periphery of the floodplain. All right, so since the floodway is a heavily regulated portion of the floodplain, as Mr. Lidstone pointed out, in the ordinance and per FEMA regulations, you have to conduct a no-rise analysis. And what that no-rise analysis boils down to is you create a model, you look at the elevations, you then change the model to represent what you're trying to do in the floodplain, and make sure you're not increasing those water surface elevations. The ordinance just boils that down to a couple of sentences, but you have to look to FEMA for actually how to do this. You have to follow FEMA regulations and FEMA guidelines. This is the document that tells us how to do that. This is procedures for no-rise certification for proposed developments in the regulatory floodway. This is issued by FEMA Region 10, which is the region that covers Oregon. It provides all the details. I won't get into that. Mr. Lidstone mentioned that, talking about the duplicate deck, the corrected model, and so on and so forth, where you do comparisons. At the end of this document, they provide sample text for a no-rise certification. At the end of your analysis, if you believe that your proposed projects will not cause a rise, the engineer needs to fill out a no-rise certificate, stamp it, and it says that the proposed development in the floodplain, proposed activities in the floodway rather, will not impact the 100-year flood elevations as well as floodway elevations. And it is important to recognize that those are two different sets of elevations, okay? The floodplain elevations are the unencroached, that's the full width of the floodplain. Floodway elevations are higher than floodplain elevations. Those are based on the encroached condition. That's sort of the future condition. Once we put a bunch of fill in the periphery, we expect the floodplain will be higher. You must meet both of these criteria. And in fact, when you do a no-rise report as an engineer, this is just a sample table from a past report. you have to do a comparison, and Mr. Lidstone showed that comparison. You take these are the elevations at each of the cross-sections for your current conditions in the floodplain. You then modify the model to show what you propose to do. You look at those elevations, you do a little simple subtraction, and hopefully you end up with a bunch of zeros or negative values. You just can't have increases. That's for the unencroached condition, the floodplain. You also have to do that for the floodway, for the encroached condition. That is a different set of elevations, and those other set of elevations also have to show no rise. And the reason they do that is FEMA assumes that at some point in the future, based on their allowable development, the floodway fringe will be filled in, and we'll be dealing with a different height floodplain. And we now need to make sure that people didn't put a bunch of stuff in the floodway that will now make the new floodplain elevation even higher. So when people had to build their houses to 1 foot above the base flood elevation, now if you put a bunch of stuff in the floodway too, and you didn't consider that, now you've got water going in the front door. So at this point, the Lidstone analysis has not followed FEMA procedures all the way. They've done part of the analysis. I don't find fault with the model itself in terms of how they constructed it, but they need to take it the next step. Currently, they have not met FEMA criteria, and a floodplain permit should not be issued based on that. Otherwise, county would be in violation of the National Flood Insurance Program. Okay, stepping back from the no-rise analysis, I just want to talk a little bit about a few other points that were brought up. So Mr. Lidstone talked about the HCC RAS model. It's a good model. It's widely used. I find no faults with it. It is a one-dimensional model. And what a one-dimensional model is, there's all sorts of models you can use to look at a floodplain. Some are more complex than others. This one-dimensional model is sort of the minimal level of complexity, but it is widely used. And what it does is it gives us average results. So at each of these lines across the floodplain that I mentioned, these are the cross-sections where the model can give us information about the floodplain. It can only give us average information. So the report talks about velocities, because one of the concerns is if you do things like building a 2,000-foot-long berm in a regulatory floodway, will that impact velocities and cause potentially erosion on adjacent properties? That's something we care about. And the conclusions that they came to were that no, we would not see any appreciable increase in velocities. And the report showed very small increases, and looking at the model output, they came to a correct conclusion that based on average velocities, it's not going to change very much. But we need to understand the limitations of what this model can tell us. It's really important because this is a really big floodplain. This is several miles wide, okay? Rivers over here in the Willamette. This yellow portion of the cross-section, this is the left overbank, the left side of the floodplain, everything to the left of the channel. And when that cross-section cuts through the berm, they have to modify the geometry in the model to show the berm. And then you get the model output and see if it changes the velocity. But you have to recognize that that velocity that's calculated is averaged over 14,000 feet. So if you average a change over a really big area, it's not going to look like a whole lot. And we could probably, just through common sense, recognize that if we change things in the floodplain, there's going to be more localized effects. We might expect different areas, changes in velocity that might be more pronounced near the proposed changes. And as we get further away, those changes might decrease a little bit. This model cannot tell us that. Even if I had this model in my hands, I could not tell you that. This is just a limitation. So you have to be very careful in how you interpret this, especially with these velocities. Okay, one further point here. When you create a model, such as was done here, they drew all these cross-sections. These are the gray lines now. I changed the color. Hopefully you can see them. With a one-dimensional model, it's assumed that all the water is going generally downstream. In a floodplain of this size, we know that's really not the case. It's more complicated than that. Flows in floodplains tend to be more two-dimensional. Water's not just going downstream, it's going side to side. The velocities change across the floodplain. Even the water surface elevation is not consistent across the floodplain. There's high areas, there's low areas. Flow direction is not the same in all areas of the floodplain. But with a one-dimensional model, we kind of have to make a simplifying assumption. And it's up to the modeler to have an understanding of what direction they think the flows are going. And when you draw these cross-sections, you can see they're kind of all oriented in different ways. You have to draw them such that they're perpendicular to the anticipated direction of flow. So what we can deduce based on the modeling that was done is these blue lines represent the direction they expect water to be going in this area. Because if they didn't do that, then the model's not set up correctly. It has to be perpendicular to the cross-sections. That's just a foundational component of using the HEC RAS model. Okay, I know this might be a little hard to see, but in red here, this is the berm that they are proposing to build. This is a really big piece of infrastructure. This is 2,000 feet long, 18 feet high. At its peak, it might be as much as 150 feet wide. And what you can see is that that's at an angle that is skewed to the flow direction based on the modeling that they have conducted. Now, it doesn't take a hydraulic engineer to draw some conclusions from this. Anyone who's been to the beach, played in the surf, been on a river in a boat, we might consider that if we put an obstruction at a skew to an anticipated flow direction of water, it's probably going to change the direction of flow. The ordinances even talk about this. They say, you should not be doing activities that push more flow onto neighboring properties. For whatever reason, the ordinance only talks about that in the flood fringe. I don't understand why it's not in the floodway, because the floodway is even more heavily regulated. But regardless, we still need to step back and make sure that, we are not doing harm to others, okay? When we're green lighting projects like this, when we're issuing floodplain permits, when someone like myself is doing an analysis and I'm trying to decide what the impact is here, it's probably pretty clear from this that some amount of flow is going to be redirected. They are segmenting this berm, as I understand it, so there will be some little gaps, but that's not enough. It's still a 2,000-foot long, effectively a wall, skewed to the direction of anticipated flow in a highly regulated FEMA floodway. This is a big floodplain. It's complicated. This is a big project, and we have to recognize that there are local impacts to velocity, flow direction, and flood elevations, and we don't know what they are. This model cannot tell us that. It's not that Mr. Lidstone can't figure that out from the model. It's just the model can't tell us that. It's a limitation. I can't tell you that with the model either. We would need something more like a two-dimensional model, which not only tells us how these things change as we go down the river valley, but they would also tell us how these things change from side to side. A two-dimensional model tells you how these things change in all areas. So it could tell you, well, are we going to be redirecting flow onto neighboring properties? Some of that flow that might have gone north, now over here, now it's going to go over to the northeast. When you squeeze flow lines like that, you would expect an increase in velocity. When you block off an area just downstream, you're probably going to get a decrease in velocity, and that'll usually cause an increase in flood elevations. That's basic river mechanics. So we have to consider, number one, they haven't met the FEMA requirements for how to conduct a no-rise. We also have to step back. Let's say they take the next step and they can still show no rise even under the encroached condition. I don't know if they can or not. They have not done the analysis. But even if they can, we still have to step back, just ask ourselves, does this make sense? Is this a good idea? Do we have enough information that we're not causing harm to people? With a model that only speaks in averages, are we comfortable with that for such a big project? If this was a few houses with a little bit of fill on a small river, maybe we're totally comfortable. But big river, complicated floodplain, even if the average velocities are pretty low, it's something we still need to think about. I think my last point, actually I'm going to leave my last point alone because I had to do an interpretation of the ordinance about fill in floodways, and that's already been spoken to. I would just like to say I agree that the ordinance seems pretty clear that you cannot build a levee or put fill in a floodway based on my interpretation. That's all I have. Thank you. If you have any questions.
No.
Any questions, Mary?
No, thank
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and now, you said Katie,
Yes,
help me, Kula?
Kula.
Thank you,
Yes,
Katie.
like Kula.
Okay. And Casey, are you gonna,
He's going to be up here with her.
you're gonna give her moral support?
Yeah,
Very
I'm
good.
speaking for both of us. How about
Okay,
that?
thank you.
Okay, let's pull up.
And I didn't fill out the form either, so.
Oh, I did. I filled one out
Yeah.
for you.
I have one.
Wives can
For
do
both
that,
of you.
right? Okay. For the record, we are Katie and Casey Kula. We live at 18705 Southeast Upper Island Road, Dayton. And also with us today are our children, Dottie and Rusty, who are here today because we actually homeschool them. I thought about getting childcare, or I thought this could be our lesson today in the public process. So we'll see how much they absorb, but they're here. Good morning. Thank you so much. We have been farming. Oh, well, first of all, just a fun picture of a flood on Grand Island. That's from 2012. That's Grand Island Road just north of our property. It's just a nice picture of what can happen on the island. Okay, for context for us speaking, we live on the island. We farm there. We've been there since 2006. I've outlined our property here and show you the relationship to the Baker Rock property here. I want to step back just briefly from what we're doing today. You've obviously already heard testimony on the floodplain permit, and this process all started, 6 years ago with a whole different set of commissioners. And we had many, many, many hours of testimony on other issues like traffic and the bridge, and those have all been talked about. Obviously today we're talking about floods, which are a very important part of this whole question for us on the island. So that's why we're here today, technically. Why are we here again in spirit? Why are we still here? I wanted to address that briefly. First of all, it's not because it's been easy to keep paying attention to this issue for the last 6 or 7 years. It's not because it's been easy to talk to agencies and to come here and to prepare testimony. The reason that we are still here and that other people who are here in opposition is because we still fundamentally believe that this proposed quarry will have adverse effects for Grand Island and its surrounding areas. Or in other words, we still think that this proposed quarry is a bad idea. And it's our goal today, as well as other people speaking, to give you, as the commissioners, ample legal and logical grounds to agree with us and to decline this permit at this time. You three and I are all Yamhill County citizens. I know that part of why you are commissioners is because you care about the people in this county who live here, who work here, about protecting our livelihoods. The reason that this issue is brought before you is because it is complex. It is not something that can just be rubber stamped. It does require people who care to consider the complexity of the issue and to weigh the opinions and to make an informed decision. And I very much appreciate your role in that today. And I think that Sid has already addressed, well, both speakers have already addressed that what has been presented as a cut and dry rubber stamp question is not, that there is room for interpretation. And I want to provide some more big picture in addition to what's already been said. And there's a few points in my presentation I'll skip because they've been brought up, but I'll reiterate that I agree, just to be cognizant of everybody's time. I have 3 main reasons that I want to give in addition to what you've already heard about why we think that there's ample reason to decline this floodplain permit as it is currently on the record. The first reason to decide, and this again, Ken Pune just addressed this, is that the hydrology study offers an incomplete picture of the potential impacts on Grand Island and surrounding areas. The fact that it does not currently meet the FEMA no-rise criteria right there, you have enough grounds to legally decline this. I want to go a little bit further, and I took, as a citizen, a further look at what the data has been given and the limitations of it, and I wanted to look at it more visually, and I'm going to share that with you. So I'm going to be building on what Ken Pune just discussed at length about the limits of that one-dimensional modeling. In the floodplain permit, we were given tables of data, numbers and lists. When I looked at them, I had to really concentrate to figure out even which cross-sections applied to the quarry versus upstream, downstream. I'm a very visual person, so I thought when I was preparing for this that it would be useful to actually take that exact data and look at it more closely to get a better picture of, okay, even within these limits of what I knew were averages represented over these 3 to 4 mile cross-sections in some cases, what is the change specifically in the velocity of the flow? And I made 3 different graphs. I'm just going to share one with you today for the sake of brevity. But here's what happened. I graphed what is the percentage change in average velocity. So not the actual number, but how much it's changed between the existing conditions and each of the models that were offered by Baker Rock. And this is what I found. This is the reclamation model. So this is the long-term, into the future state of this quarry being modeled. And if I look at the percentage of change in average velocity, suddenly the quarry site stands out, which it wasn't standing out to me in the table form. You can see right here I've labeled it quarry site, and you can see we've got these big pop-ups. These are the elevation, or sorry, not the elevation change, the change in velocity and over the quarry site. And we can see there is a change in this model in the velocity of the floodwaters. In one point, and again, this is just one cross-section across a very large space, there's an 83% increase in the velocity. Now, those resulting numbers, as Chris Lidstone has pointed out, are still relatively slow-moving water. Again, we're looking at these averages in terms of being not erosive. But again, after presenting this to the planning commissioners, I thought, well, so if we're talking about an average over this long distance, again, I have a map somewhat similar to what Ken Pune's shown here. If these are the cross-sections identified on the floodplain map, I've highlighted the leftover bank, so that's what was used in this analysis with red, and then I've highlighted the part that actually crosses the quarry with green. And you can see how small that is in the scheme of the whole cross-section. The longest one, or the biggest one, represents 25% of the cross-section distance, but in the case of this far south one, it's actually only 8% of the cross-section. So again, the numbers that are presented to you in these reports are being stretched over that whole distance. I think we can presume, since we're talking about technological models, which of course are so handy and clean compared to the complexity of the real world, the only thing that has changed between the existing conditions model and the proposed model are the actual proposed features, right? This is, of course, not how real world works. Every time you change one thing, there's a million other things. But in a computer modeling, only one thing changes. So when we look at the effects that are there, such as we can see in this graph, we can presume that the vast majority of that change is happening right here, possibly even in part of that site. We don't know. Again, this is a limitation of the one-dimensional modeling. And so, again, I wanted to see, well, what happens? Because with data, with math, you can look at numbers. If we figure out the percentage of the cross-section that's represented by the site, and we take that change, and we apply it only to that. So we basically are going to adjust to see what would that difference be without that. And I got some interesting numbers that are compelling to me. And again, this is me taking their data directly from the floodplain permit, and what I'm doing in many ways is hypothetical because we're taking the limitations, but I wanted as a thought experiment to see what's possible here. You know, what might be lying under the surface of this. So in this graph, these blue diamonds at the bottom represent the velocity of the existing conditions, And then all the other features are the different models. The green triangles are the process pond, the red squares are the noise berm, and these little cross things are the reclamation. And so these numbers are higher now than what was in the table, which I knew would happen. I wasn't sure how much higher they would go. In one case, one of them goes up to 5.62 feet per second, which in an earlier testimony, Chris Lidstone had cited 5 feet per second as being possibly erosive velocities of water. Now again, I've taken it and I've squeezed it. We still don't know if that's representative either. It could be that, say, for example, with the noise berm, any effect is happening very localized. Or it could be spread out more than these represent. So what we have is still a limitation of what we have in terms of understanding what's really going to happen on the ground, on the site, and to surrounding users. And to be honest, at times when I ponder this, I'm surprised that Baker Rock themselves don't want more detailed information as they plan the site. As somebody who lives on the island and has seen the high velocity flows, I would want that data before planning my business. Okay, so and then I also calculated what the percentage change is for my adjusted model. And again, remember I had that 83% increase? Well, now we're looking at a 323% increase in the velocity potentially, or 215%, or 233%. Again, these are just to show what we don't know. The other thing that I think is important and unique in this case, and why a more sensitive model should be used on this particular case, again, as Kim Pune said, in some water systems with some projects, one-dimensionally modeling is totally sufficient. Grand Island is a more sensitive area. This is also a very big project, and I think that also makes it unique. Some of these features that are being proposed, again, in the floodway are massive. Again, the noise berm, potentially 18 feet tall, 144 feet wide, 2,350 feet long with some breaks. To put this in context, that would require 6 million cubic feet of fill to construct. And it's a footprint of 300-some thousand square feet, which would cover 7 acres of land. I was playing around on my way here this morning to see if we could come up with a visual of how big that is. That's if you took half of a McMinnville city block from the intersection here by the courthouse at 5th and Evans and went all the way to the high school. One solid structure with some breaks. I believe that the size of this warrants more study. So again, that's another reason. Okay, reason number 2, to decline. The south end of Grand Island is actively eroding right now. And I feel as though it's probably Chris Lidstone's job to make that sound okay. For us on the island, this is something that is on our mind. It's something that's been on the mind of people who live on the island since people started farming on the island. Here's another aerial photo of the island.
And this is a new one, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is a new aerial photo. The ones that Liz and Associates have been using are from 2007, 2006,
yeah.
something like that. So that's
This
why,
is
you know,
2015, I believe,
yeah,
this one.
Sorry.
So many generations ago, farmers on the island, knowing that erosion is an issue on the island, it's always been an issue, they planted what they called this cottonwood, well, they called it BAM, which I guess is the local word for cottonwood orchard, specifically to prevent erosion. This is land that they could have been farming, and they set it aside because they knew this was a critical end of the island. We're between this side channel that's cut through historically and an oxbow in the river. There's a lot of pressure potentially over the years on the south end. And as was pointed out by Chris Lidstone, the Army Corps also built a wing dam here to prevent erosion. Although water still flows, we're still an island. But down here, I want to draw your attention. Down here right now, there is active erosion happening on the island. I mean active right now. I want to show you a picture of what I'm talking about. This is 2011. This is just a family photo. I tried to find one without a child, but apparently I don't take pictures without children these days. So we used to go down. This is right here on this in the park. At the end of a trail, there used to be a beach that we would go and hang out at and swim at. And as you can see in this photo, which is why I include it, there's ample room for beach blankets, for sitting, for throwing rocks. And this is part of the river. So here's another image of it, a July 2011 satellite image. Look, you can see that beach right here, peeking out from underneath the tree line. I got another satellite image. What happened was 2012, we had the biggest flood that we've lived through, and that's the one I had the opening image from. The next summer we went down, beach is gone. If you go down there now, you'll see cut banks into the earth. You can see the roots of trees sticking out. There's no more river rock at all. It's just earth exposed, and you can see that represented. I wanted to get a picture of it, but you know, in the winter it's hard to actually get to the river on Grand Island. The river's much higher there. But what you can see in this satellite image from 2 summers ago now is that you can no longer see any beach. And this is a representative picture of what's happening on the island. And back to this map, this is happening all up along here. In fact, a farmer who was farming this field a few years ago had to actually relocate his diversion point for his irrigation water because the pump was getting, the whole site for it was getting eroded and it was going to fall into the river. This is happening now. And what can happen with this kind of erosion is that you might have a couple winters with not much river level activity, not much happens, you have a big flood event, you could potentially, and Sam Sweeney is going to speak to this, you can lose tons of ground in one flood event. So this is a part of the island that we feel like is sensitive. They have their setbacks, which, by the way, are state park, so there's nothing, they're not giving free land to these setbacks. It's actually part of the park already. But we're still concerned. We think that this site represents a particularly vulnerable area. Okay, last point here, and it's mostly irradiation, so I should be able to move on quickly. The third reason that we believe you should decline, in addition to what's already been said, is that there are incomplete and changing plans for the fish channel feature. Right now, it's actually kind of unclear to me, and it seems to be unclear at maybe even at Dogami, exactly what's going on with the fish channel. There was new information for us today in this hearing. When this application was first submitted in 2010, the big application with the big hours and hours and hours of testimony, the fish channel location at that time was right here. And there were schematics and diagrams, and it was discussed at length about that particular position and how that meets Goal 5, et cetera, et cetera. Then at Dogami on the file, there was a memo put in by Baker Rock talking about 3 options. So that one over here going to the park, and this third one going into Skeeter Creek, this feature, this flood channel on the island, which at the time they were talking about excavating through to connecting to the river. That part has been dropped, apparently. I'm not sure. Either way, the point is NOAA and ODF&W are both still weighing in on the, at the moment, fish channel plan. It has not yet been finalized and approved by agencies who need to give it approval. It is part of the hydrology of the site. Chris Lidstone has repeatedly said that it is not a significant enough feature to study because of the size of it. However, given its location on Skeeter Creek, we believe that it could potentially have some influence on floodwaters and that it itself could be perhaps at risk at floodwaters. One thing, again, with their study is there's cross-sections, again. Where that would connect is about right here, and I want to point out that the way that the cross-sections fall across the site, there's actually very, very, very little analysis of Skeeter Creek and its existing conditions, let alone proposed modeling changed conditions. As somebody who lives on the island, I can tell you this is this feature of the island, I call it a flood channel. We call it Skeeter Creek locally. It's not actually a creek in that it does not flow or connect to the river except during flood events. I like to tell visitors to our farm, because it goes right through our farm, that's a pond and creek shape. Because it looks like a creek, but for the vast majority of the years, the water is not moving, it's not flowing. But during flood events, this is where water comes onto the island first. There's a low spot on the river that we call the dip, and that's what will fill first. Water flows very quickly, especially at the beginning of every flood event. So even the low flood events, like the kind we have every 1 or 2 years, There's very, very fast-moving water that fills Skeeter Creek and flows across the island. I believe that this deserves two-dimensionally modeling in order to understand the relationship between that and the quarry. Okay, so to reiterate, in addition to everything that's been said, hydrology report does not meet FEMA no-rise criteria. One-dimensional hydrology study offers an incomplete picture of a very sensitive site. Grand Island is actively eroding, which adds to the sensitivity of this case. And there is, at this point, lack of approved detailed plans and analysis of the fish channel. Again, this is to reiterate what was said earlier about how this is coming to the county prematurely, that the county at this point cannot give an informed consent to a floodplain permit when features of this are still in flux and have not been approved by agencies who need to approve them. On all of those grounds, we respectfully request that this permit be denied at this time. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I have a slide that'll be for our next presenter, but I can answer questions if there are any before that.
Mary?
No, thank you.
No.
Mr. Olson?
Okay, thank you
Katie,
so much.
thank you very much. Very, very good presentation.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Okay. And I have Gary Van Otten. If you would, your name and address for the record, please, and speak into the microphone.
Yes, I'm Gary Van Otten. My address is 1907 Tahuna Terrace in Corona Del Mar, California. So it's a little cooler here than when I left home. My wife Nancy and I own 400 acres of land at the south end of Grand Island, represented on the slide you see there, and as such, the private landowners, we're the ones who abut the proposed Baker Rock mining site more than anybody else. Several people have given some background to you of their professional reason to be here. I'll give you a different background. I grew up in Amity, and in the 60s, I, along with a whole bunch of high school kids guys from Dayton and Amity, worked on Grand Island. I moved irrigation and bucked hay on this land. So there's not only a landowner interest here, but a bit of an emotional interest here in what goes on Grand Island for me. My wife Nancy and I have the following concerns, and these are a little different than people have brought up here before, and a little different than I've seen in previous testimony. I also waded through 1,000 some odd pages of testimony trying to figure out, what was right, what was wrong, how I really thought about what was going on. And beyond what you've heard, we've got several other concerns here. Testimony has already been given here before the Planning Commission stating that the Harney site starts to flood when the Willamette River hits about 22 feet. I've seen pictures of the site starting to flood at more like 20 feet, but to be conservative, at 22 feet, the site's going to be flooded. With a total Harney site elevation gradient of only about a half foot from one end to the other of it at 22 or 22, and it's somewhere in that range, everything on that site is flooded. There's been a lot of testimony so far about potential net increase in high water mark water levels, but during a flood event, and about changes in water velocities, but I don't recall anybody testifying about what might happen in the period of time from April 1 to November 1, when by previous agreement or previous proposal, there will be no aggregate compiled or stored on site. Although that is considered non-flood season on Grand Island, I think one of the things that you all need to consider is that's not necessarily the only, there isn't a ordinance that says between April 1 and November 1 the river cannot flood. And in fact, the river does flood between November 1 and April 1. And if you'll, what I've written here is since 1937, between April 1 and November 1, the river's hit flood stages above 22 feet 3 separate times. 23.5 feet on April 2nd in 1931, 22.4 feet on April 16th in 1937, 22.86 feet on May 8th, 1963, and actually once in June, I think it was about in the mid-60s, it actually hit 20 feet in June. So the river does not necessarily comply with an April 1 to November 1 timeline. And if you figure that is 3 times in 85 years or once on every 28 years on average, and Baker's going to mine for at least 30 years, odds are there's going to be a flood event that's going to come through that site during the period of time when there may be piles of aggregate on the site. For that reason alone, I don't think you can approve this as it stands. You know, that something has to change there. You're looking for a potential problem at a time you didn't expect it. The noise berm seems to be a topic that everybody likes to talk about here, but a couple things I don't think have been considered yet. One is that if Baker's planning on segmenting or articulating, I think, as they said in their proposal, this noise berm so as to avoid building what is really, in essence, a almost half-mile by 8-foot by 18-foot dike right in the middle of the floodway, right? When you do that segmentation, though, water, if you push it up against a sieve of any size, right, and you put force behind it, the velocities that go through those holes is much higher than if it was a big open area. So, and I don't think anybody's addressed what are the dimensions of these openings going to be, and what is the flood velocity going to be once you force that water through those openings. It will certainly be much higher than has been modeled so far. And as they talk about remodeling things, at that point, those velocities are not modeled, and those velocities might very well be highly erosive, and even erosive to their own berm. The third thing is that I don't think has been addressed here is that, as you all know, if you put a big object in the middle of a flow, there's I call it a velocity shadow. I'm not a hydrologist, but there is an area behind whatever you put there where water flows and eddies around and behind. In other words, the velocity drops and actually can reverse itself in these eddies. And this is anecdotal, so don't take this one as gospel, but when those floods go across Grand Island, there's areas after the flood where there's another inch or 2 inches of silt, right, laid down at the end of the flood. I don't know how much silt would get laid down behind a structure in the middle of a floodway, but there certainly would be a considerable amount of material dropped out, and that material will get dropped out into Skeeter Creek, which will alter the nature of the creek in a way that it is not currently altered, and therefore something I think you all also need to consider when you're looking at this plan. And that's all I have to say, unless you have questions.
Commissioner?
No, thank you.
Okay. No. Thank you very much, Ms. Van Otten. Appreciate you being here today. Larry Oya? Yes, if you would, just give them to Crystal. Thank you. And if you would state your name and address and speak into the microphone, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
All right. For the record, my name is Larry Oyu. I'm the Executive Director for the Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District, located at 2200 Southwest 2nd Street in McMinnville. Chair Primizich and Commissioners Olson and Sterrett, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here today. I appreciate it. I'm going to get organized here. I don't have a PowerPoint. So our Conservation District has provided testimony from the previous permit and for the floodplain permit. I just wanted to follow up and offer some supplemental information and reinforce our position that we would recommend that this floodplain permit be denied. The district is concerned about the floodplain modifications and the negative effects that it will have on the greenway, potentially on neighboring properties and wildlife habitat and wildlife species in the region. We submitted a letter on November 2nd regarding the floodplain permit, and in that letter I referenced a study prepared by Lidstone in 2006, a year before this work, according to Mr. Lidstone, when they started working on this on 2007 on this particular project. And I would encourage you to review pages 33 through 35 of that study And I just want to speak a little bit about that, some of our observations and why we're concerned. I'm not a hydrofluvial geologist. We don't have one on staff, but we do a lot of work with water, and we consult with USDA and other consultants on projects. So we do have some familiar. We are familiar with hydraulics and have real life experience seeing some of the head cutting that's happening on Lambert Bend and some other sites. So the things on those pages that I want to draw to your attention are the study states that upstream from this site at Lambert Bend, there will be an inevitable cutoff of a new channel cut through Lambert Bend. And those pages go on to talk about the changes in velocity, the changes in upstream and downstream effects, channel meandering, and the eventual capturing of existing pits downstream from Lambert Bend. So one of the questions we have is the modeling that's been talked about. Does it consider that at some point this modeling reflects how the property will be protected and not affect neighboring landowners once this inevitable cutoff happens? So I'd like that to just be considered as you look at those pages in that report by the consultant. The pages 33 through 35 also talk about equilibrium of the river system and disequilibrium of the system, and it states, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not going to read the whole 2.5 pages, that once some of those pits are captured and there's new channels cut or new meanders, there will be a long-term disequilibrium of the river system. So if that's the case, it just seems to us that there's a higher risk of a new channel and effects on this proposed site in the floodplain that maybe the modeling is not considering. And again, I don't have any way to analyze that, or I guess my suggestion would be to consider and ask the question about the modeling in terms of this inevitable change upstream of the pit. In addition to that, I'm just going to make a statement that we've heard comments about the latitude of the commission to take a broader view of this floodplain permit, and I agree with some of the things that Mr. Friedman and others have said, that other than a net elevation issue, I believe there's latitude for you to make a decision that would provide long-term protection to the neighbors, neighboring properties in this area and the entire floodplain and riparian area. So with that, you can read my written testimony, and that's a summary of the district's position.
Thank you very much, Larry. Any questions, Mary?
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, and we do have your testimony here. Okay. I now have Sam Sweeney, please. And again, if you would state your name and address for the record, please. And
Good morning, County Commissioners. I don't know if it's morning anymore or not. It's kind of late. Anyway, for the record, my name is Sam Sweeney. I live at 1070 Ferry Street, Dayton, Oregon. My record, or my historical background, has been in this Dayton, Grand Island area nearly my entire life. We farm down there. We have some land just a few hundred feet downstream from Grand Island. We farmed on Grand Island. We know a lot of the folks. We've witnessed a lot of the floods through the years, and so, just from a personal standpoint, I know quite a bit about the area. I also am a director for the Soil and Water Conservation District for Zone 5, and I've been connected with a lot of different efforts throughout the years in trying to stabilize Lambert Bend. And I just want to say that in all those efforts, we failed. I want to just show you on this. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I don't even know how to work a PowerPoint presentation, but let me show you. Let's see. This is the Lambert Bend area right here. first of all, I'm gonna turn it around. This is Grand Island right here. This is, the river's on this side. Willamette River right here goes like that. Do I have that right side up? Yeah. Anyway, here's the applicant's, site right here. And so then on the west side is Lambert Slough, and it exits out down here. So when you turn it around, here we are. This is the very tip of Grand Island, right here. And as we go down through here, let's see if I got this right. Yeah. So as we go down through here, we come to a point where, I kind of got that backwards, don't I? Yeah, it's upside down. All right, sorry about that. So as we come down through here again is the tip of Grand Island. We come down through here, I've got it backwards again. And this is the Lambert Bend area right in here. And so there's been an island built up of rock that's come all the way down from the Salem area. It's washed down through there. It's built an island up here. It's probably about 3 or 4 acres in size, about 3 foot tall. So what that does, that blocks the river flow right here. And what it does is forcing a cutoff channel through here. And so down here, this is where all the mining activity is presently going on. This is where Baker Rock, Mizell, this is where they all are. So when all this water comes down, hits this island, it started to overflow because this is a lower spot. In '96, there was about a 600-foot overflow channel was created there. I mean, just in a matter of days, it's washed through there. In '97, we had another minor flood. It went through there too. And so now the cutoff point right here. So Doug Emming, Department of Mineral Industries, they decided something should be done about it because there was so much concern about all this erosion in this area. So they had Lidstone and Associates prepare a study. It was a really good study. So what they came up with was if we put a little break point there underground, then that'll kind of restrict that flow to where that will cut through, which they did. But after that, when they realized the magnitude of this problem all along through here, they went away. Now here's what they predicted could happen, and it's on pages 33 and 34 and 35 of what in your packets. I'll give you here in just a little bit. They predicted that when this will wash through, and eventually will, it's going to get all this whole area right here, all through here. But it's also going to lower all the water level up here too during the flood, which is going to influence the water, different flood levels back up there. But anyway, that's what could happen right in through here. When this washes through, and it will, right now if you go down there, it's starting to work across here, and it could even work across here. Now, all this is caused by the Army Corps of Engineers from 1880 to about 1970. They were very actively maintaining all these river structures. But after the river is no longer needed for a transportation corridor, they stopped. So as a result, you've got all these control structures that are starting to go away. There's one right here where Lambert Slough comes out. It's a huge structure, concrete piling. It's really in shambles. It just can't stand it. It needs to be maintained, but it's not going to be. So as a result, all these structures up and down the river, they're just facing a lot of deterioration. They're just in a state of rotting condition. So what that means is this whole river system is just out of sync. And Lidstone in his report, he admits that, and I concur. It's really in a sad state of affairs. So really what's happened here, the county and the May Farms, they lost 238 acres here because they can't get across the farm. We're concerned that when all this goes through here, we're going to lose a lot more land. But frankly, I don't think we'll ever be able to stop it because it's just too big, takes too much money, and I just don't think it can ever be done. So that's why I'm here today, is to warn Morning, buddy. We're afraid that could easily happen in Grand Island. And when it does, there's 4,000 acres affected. You got 30 families there that live and depend on that soil, live there, they like to live there. So, anything that goes on that we can, structural integrity in Grand Island, I think puts it in a dangerous, vulnerable, condition, subject to any kind of floods. So, you as county commissioner, you got this decision in front of you, and just want to leave this with you. There's a legal term, without a reasonable doubt, can you be assured that Baker Rock, and they're good folks, they're gonna do their best. Can you be assured that they're not gonna cause a 1-foot rise in elevation across the front end? That's not an easy decision to make. But on the safe side, I would urge you to reject this application. If you have any questions about it, I'll do my best.
Thank you. Commissioner?
Thank you, sir.
No.
Okay. Sam, thank you. Did you say you had some written testimony for us? Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I have one more intent to speak card, and that is from Chris Bledsoe. Chris, if you would, please. We're all feeling that way, so keep that.
I started out that way. My name is Chris Bledsoe, and I reside at 18695 Southeast Upper Island Road in Dayton, Oregon. Our home is on Grand Island. The Skeeter Creek that you see cutting through the island runs in our back field and actually divides our land a little bit. And so we see the flooding when it occurs. Our home is above the floodplain, so we're fine, but our land gets pretty well inundated. I've lost animals to the velocity of that flow of that creek when we have a flood event, and that's a 10-year flood event. I have not seen a 100-year flood event and hope never to. I basically concur with everything that has been said. Quite well, actually, from the previous people who testified against the application. And so I have nothing of substance to add. I do want to say that one of the things that is kind of a model for considering environmental issues, which this is a big one, is that concern about the 7th generation. I have 3 generations of my family here today. So I worry about what will happen to the island in the future that now provides a sustainable and profitable living for all of the families who reside on that island. Now, whether or not Baker Rock has a quarry on the island will not make a difference if there is a major change in the river, but what we don't know is if the quarry is allowed to be on the island, whether or not it will in fact change that future. And I would urge you to consider the fact that if there is a doubt about what will happen to the farms and the families that reside on that island and the food that is grown for our community on that island, that it should be turned down. There at Baker Rock, Todd Baker, he is a good man who is running a business that is vital to our community. We all need gravel, but we are simply saying that this is not the right spot. And many people agree with us at the state and the federal level. I have spent a fair amount of time talking to the folks at Dogami, talking to ODF and W, and just, was it Tuesday, I spent an hour and a half face-to-face with 3 staff members of NOAA as they were going through some of their ideas about this application, asking me a little bit more about the flow of the water. And I will assure you that this is not an easy decision for them, for ODF&W. They are spending a tremendous amount of time because at face value, this is not doable. And so what they, in their role, are trying to do is to figure out a way that they can work with Baker Rock, but they cannot bend the concerns that they have about the animals and the fish in particular that come through that area. It's a vital breeding ground for salmon. And as you all know, salmon is in decline. And they have drawn a line in the sand that anything that is going to damage the fish population should not be permitted. And until they get, which they do not have, a good explanation from Baker Rock as to how the fish channel, how the existence of that quarry is compatible with the goal of preserving the fish, they can't really proceed. They don't want to put obstacles. It's not like they're looking to get Baker Rock. They want to work with Baker Rock, but in fact, nobody that I've talked to thinks that this project is actually conceivable. It's just the wrong location. And so one of the things that I think should strongly enter into your decision today is if none of the agencies that have been charged with making comments and eventually will make decisions regarding this application think that this is ever going to happen unless something significantly changes about the application. You don't want to be the only people that have approved something that everybody else agrees is really a dangerous decision to make. I would strongly suggest that you hold off, turn this down now, hold off, wait until the details have been worked out. Right now, this is not really a complete application. There's lots of numbers, and they've done the necessary required steps, but they haven't actually completed their plan of what to do. And for both NOAA and ODF&W, one of the primary concerns that they have is not just when the quarry is active, but the forever period at which that reclamation plan will be in effect. There has to be not just a plan to take care of the fish and make certain that there's no net rise today or tomorrow, but forever. That is their obligation, forever. And if something that they have done at that location damages the fish or creates a problem on the island, according to NOAA, the county is liable, as is anybody else who has recommended approval of this, liable for all of the illegal takings of the fish. And I would submit, and I don't mean this as a threat, but if something happened to my property, and I've already made a comment to the file to this effect, then I will also hold anybody who's made a decision, including, of course, Baker Rock, liable for the loss of my property and the loss of the future of farming on our island. And none of that is meant to be negative or threatening. It's just the reality of how fragile this environment is. This is not a hill in the middle of a bunch of dry land. This is a very, very low spot of land that is continually battered by the weather and frequently has floods. That does not seem to be a good place to do business. Now, where we are, the floods don't come up as much or as often. That particular piece of land is underwater. You cannot get there. If there is any, I would say if it's above 21 feet, you cannot get to that land. They wouldn't even be able to get down there to open their their gate. I mean, nobody can get down there at all. That's just for months when there's a lot of rain and a really wet winter, you cannot access that area. So I join my voice and everybody else's to say this is not the time, this is not the place, and I urge you to turn down this application. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Any questions, Mary? Questions? Thank you very much. At this time, then, I would ask for the report from the Planning Department.
Public agency reports?
Public
Yes.
agency report.
There were no additional
Thank you.
public agency reports.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Okay, then, we will now allow the applicant time for rebuttal to the information that's been brought forth.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Chris Lidstone with Lidstone Associates. I appreciate again the opportunity to be here and appreciate the opportunity to prepare this rebuttal. Some of the information I've heard today is the first time I've heard it, and I will make my address as best as I can. And some of this information has been presented before in the past, and I'll repeat. And I do call your attention to the record because my office and I have prepared a written rebuttal of much of this testimony, both at the Goal 5 hearing and at the Planning and Zoning meeting that we had, hearing we had in November. So again, you've got it in the testimony, or in the written record, a number of things. First of all, going to the Lambert Bend report, and by implication, that I wrote a report 1 year in 2006 and then changed my mind by 2007. Well, that's just not true. And I really, if this is a relevant issue in your decision-making process, I think they should look at the entire report so you realize that a lot of these issues have been taken out of context. Lambert Bend is approximately 9 miles downstream from this site. Since the date of the Lambert Bend report, there have been 2 county hearings on gravel pits, one for St. Paul in Marion County, and the other one is a Yamhill County site called Bernard Towing. In both cases, hydraulic models of a potential Lambert Bend cutoff were completed to see what the impacts of the hydraulics would be should that ever take place. As a geomorphologist, you look at an entire river system, and nobody today from either Baker Rock or the opposition is arguing that the Willamette River is a static system. It's not. I mean, erosion occurs, deposition occurs. With or without core revetments, the channel changes. And again, we just aren't arguing that. We aren't arguing that there is no such thing as global warming. There's issues about releases from reservoirs changing. The key thing that you need to look at today is certainly the flood development permit, and whether or not it meets the nature of your own code. And certainly, from going back to the hearing, and I'll try to address point by point, a number of these issues have been raised. And if I've missed anything, it's probably from memory failing me than anything else. So I'll try to cover what I can. Essentially, Sid mentioned about prime farmland. That was addressed in the Goal 5 on the soils and so forth. That was all part of the Goal 5 criteria. And there is a resource development process of looking at the volume of rock and so forth as you're dealing with soils and soil types. Sid talked about tremendous amounts of fill being placed in the floodplain. And there was a later reference by somebody about these large volumes of aggregate stockpiles. The fill is being placed in the floodplain or the floodway is basically the noise berm and the berm around the process water pond. The stockpiles are there as temporary stockpiles, and they will be removed before the high water periods. And that's a commitment by Baker Rock and a mandate within the framework of permit conditions. I think Katie mentioned some large volume of fill associated with the noise berm because this thing was 18 feet high by 2,000 feet long, 3-to-1 side slopes, millions of yards of fill. Well, the reality is it's not 18 feet high at all locations. The maximum height is 18 feet. According to the permit and the way it was considered in the noise modeling, it varies between 6 feet to 18 feet in different locations. A gentleman, Gary Van Otten, was concerned about flows and flows around it. Bearing in mind, during a 100-year event, you've got water on both sides of this berm. You get 18 feet of water on this portion of Grand Island. So you are dealing with areas the water is basically, the berm is submerged, and you've got openings that are also equally submerged. So hydraulically, you're looking at the impacts of this berm as being strictly a roughness feature within a very, very large water. Nobody is questioning that during the 100-year event, this is a major, major flood event in the Willamette Valley. And the key questions that we addressed during the Goal 5 hearings were the actions of Baker Rock going to impact the behavior of that 100-year event. The fact that you're actually lowering the surface means you're actually providing storage for water. You're no longer, when you have a higher surface, the water surface gets higher. When you actually lower the ground surface, you actually create some storage. To some degree, and you may ask the question is how can you build a berm in a floodway and result in no net rise? It's because of the compensatory storage of lowering the ground in other areas. So it's just a water balancing situation there on a hydraulic basis. I think Sid mentioned about digging a hole next to a river and the hole getting captured. Again, there's a hydraulic issue here associated with this hole is filled with water. And basically, at the time of the flood, the water level within this mine pit changes with groundwater. And groundwater is alluvial water, which is connected to the river. So as the river water rises, the water level within the mining area also rises. And so basically, when you start looking at things like erosion, and that picture that Katie showed of the road and the water kind of coming across, is if you got a change in elevation where the water just kind of cascades from a high area to a low area, you will get hydraulics, you'll get turbulent flow, you'll get erosion and so forth. If the pits are filled with water as water level is rising, as I showed you in that one photograph where the water level actually backs in, essentially the water level of the pit is equivalent to where the water level of the river is as it's rising in there. That's a really key part of the mining plan consideration. Wet mining, and again, you say is historically dry mining, they dry mine 12 months of the year. This proposed operation dry mines during the summer months, and then the water level recovers, and you're basically in this wet mining scenario. So those are, there's a lot of discussion on some of the mechanics of how this operation behaves. The other issues that we were talking about here with respect to orientation of cross sections and so forth in the fish channel, which were raised by Mr. Poon, as well as Katie. Those are all issues that, when you're looking at a comparative analysis, you're looking at a model that's accepted by FEMA, and this model is accepted by FEMA. I think we're all on the same page as one engineer to another. I think the key thing is when you are looking at it from a standpoint of trying to evaluate, against the FEMA deck, the existing deck, is you've got to maintain the orientations. We could bring in more data between the various points, maintain the area. But the reality, the fact that during these interim conditions, we actually have a negative drop in water surface elevation. That shows that basically you're near perpendicular to these levees and berms. That is being addressed. We did look at it from a sensitivity analysis to look at changes in directions of flow. What's being reported to you is looking at the leftover bank flows. Ken raised this issue of signatures. I can say from a standpoint of every floodplain development permit my office has submitted in Oregon, a stamped document, the way this was submitted to the Yamhill County, has been acceptable to FEMA. We even had FEMA had the program actually in Jackson County, in the FEMA region came down and actually reviewed the documents themselves on a different job. So this approach and presentation to Yamhill County has been acceptable to FEMA, and I can say from my experience that Yamhill County is not in danger of having a flood development program taken away. This approach has been accepted by FEMA and Region 10. So this issue should not really come into play. Again, as we look at the question that was raised about the fish channel, and the fish channel was not directly modeled. If you look at the size of the fish channel, which is 10 foot wide at the bottom width, and again, the fish channel is actually leaving trying to get back to my own document here. Yeah, that'd be great, Joe, thanks. I apologize, I'm not as, yeah. Perfect, thank you. If you look at the location of this fish channel, is this line here marks the disturbance area. This is Cedar Creek. This is a Baker Rock permit area, the Baker Rock ownership area, and so forth. Basically, all of the work is being done on the southwest side. There's a half an acre of wetland involved in here, which necessitates the core permit that is being referenced to. This dimension of this fish channel, and I take exception to the consideration that Dogami does not have a design. Dogami has a very stated, very clearly presented design, not three options. They have a single design for a fish channel. And ODF&W, in their reference that there's multiple channels, is as part of Baker Rock's effort at trying to come to consensus with, and we had meetings with NOAA Fisheries, ODF&W, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, DSL, and Dogami. And we've actually had multiple meetings in the field and at their office. One member, I think it was ODF&W, asked us for what other alternatives were looked at? It was an issue of kind of looking like you do in a NEPA, in the National Environmental Protection processes. Did you evaluate other options? We did. Some of those options weren't feasible because of landowner issues and so on and so forth. We chose what we felt was the best option, and that was the option that was presented to Dogami in February of 2016. That was the option that will be presented with a joint permit application to the Corps of Engineers and to DSL. And that option includes designs, a cross-section of a channel, an overflow structure, and so forth. The key to answer Katie Culla's concerns was that the entire capacity under full flow conditions of those structures is 140 CFS, cubic feet per second of water flow. Bearing in mind that the base flow that we're talking about here, this 100-year water surface, 100-year water flow is 255,000 cubic feet per second. So modeling Skeeter Creek on a study of this nature did not give us any change in our conclusions. And we actually did look at that. It was not included in the report because it wasn't relevant to this report. When we had to look at the flow of the Fish Channel passage, we have to kind of look to see the water. But again, and I think it's an important thing to repeat, because this was raised also, is we aren't doing any, we being Baker Rock, are not doing any work inside of Skeeter Creek. Strictly that area that's defined in that drawing. And that goes all the way from this location. This is non-owned property by Baker Rock all the way to Upper Island Road and to where it crosses into the Lamp River. And yes, I appreciate Chris Bledsoe's spending 3 hours with the agencies. I certainly have spent my time with those same agencies. All development on all floodplains is subject to a lot of NOAA's National Marine Fisheries concerns. I think this is something that you as county commissioners will be dealing with for decades and so forth, is dealing with the mining and the mine processes. We work with these agencies, and it is our intention to continue to work with these agencies. It's part of the process of mining gravel in Oregon, adjacent rivers, and I also see this in other states too. So, there's a lot of discussion on local velocities and one-dimensional models' ability to predict local velocities. I don't disagree. HEC-RAS, a one-dimensional model, looks at average velocities across the floodplain. There will be local velocities, and there's certainly not an issue of trying to change that. But with or without a Baker Rock proposed operation, those local velocities will continue to cause erosion in areas, and there will continue to be things of consideration. For a landowner, if you've got a head gate there and the water is above the head gate and it recedes down, you're going to get scour and erosion there. Let's see. One of the things I wanted to also mention as part of the considerations for the other permits and the other review processes we're dealing with is biologists are very much like other scientists. You have different biologists and different opinions. When a biologist looks at a a joint permit application, which we call that a JPA, which is what we, the developer or the operator, submits to the Corps of Engineers and the DSL. You look at the biological issues at the site, whether they're endangered species of birds, plants, animals, fish, and so forth. You evaluate each one of these individually, and it's all called a biological assessment. Baker Rock has hired some biologists to do that. Baker Rock has, their consultants have prepared a biological assessment, and those consultants have developed, as part of the biological assessment, conservation measures. The area of the fish channel in the fish culvert was the reflection of the conservation measure that is used to minimize impact. And that's truly where the biologists will continue to look at it, saying is how much does it help, what's the effect, and so on and so forth. The Dogami permit application, the floodplain development application that was submitted to Yamhill County, all address what's actually planned. And there's no reason for me to believe, based on my experience, that it's a waste of your time to review it because everything's going to change. Because, in my opinion, when I look at the plan that we prepared, it's a very good plan. I'm proud of the plan. I think it's a very workable plan. I think it's ecologically sound. As I said before, you got some groups of people that believe that any development in any floodplain or any floodway is wrong, and we should leave everything the way it was back in prehistoric times. And there are others that believe that times have changed and we have seen development, and let's try to do is mitigate that development so that we can go forward. And like I said, in response to your question, Mr. Sterrett, is there are a number of biologists right now who are actually looking at the opportunities, the increased refugia, the increased alcoves of actually how mining is actually creating some complexity for these biological processes to take place. And our whole reclamation plan was founded on that concept of sitting there trying to establish some diversity and some complexity to allow some of these biological processes to propagate. So again, I feel proud of the work that we've done, and I hope you consider that in your deliberations. I think I've covered everything.
All right, thank you. I just have a few points I want to wrap up on. First, and I hit on some of these when I started, so I won't take too long, but yeah, I mean, Baker Rock does have additional permitting processes going on right now with the state and the feds, and that's clear. And there's a requirement with the original approval and with the Planning Commission's approval in this floodplain development permit that Baker Rock continue and get all of the required approvals from any other permitting agencies. And that process is ongoing, and that's the nature of permitting processes when you're working at multiple jurisdictional levels, and that's what's going on here. The project, as Chris said, the project that's before you for consideration is the one that's illustrated up on the slide right now. There is no other option that's being considered. That's what they're taking forward. If that were to change, we'd be in a position of coming back to Yamhill County and discussing it, but that's not what's under consideration today. What's under consideration is what's in the application and what's shown up there on the screen. Included in the record are engineering plans for, in the record that was before the Planning Commission and now before the board, are plans for the fish channel. So that shouldn't be a shortcoming. That's point one. Point two, Mr. Pune had testified that he wasn't sure maybe where the county's floodplain ordinance language came from. And I know where it comes from, and I know what it is, and Baker Rock is entitled to a decision based on what's in the code today. And what's in the code today is that it says all development, including substantial improvements in the floodway, shall be prohibited unless certification is provided by a registered professional engineer demonstrating through hydrologic and hydraulic analyses performed in conformance with standard engineering practice, that the proposal will not result in any increase in flood levels. That language comes from the Code of Federal Regulations that governs FEMA, 44 CFR 60.3. I discussed that in my November 22 memo that is also in the record. That language says, and I'm just paraphrasing here, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it says that essentially local ordinances have to prohibit encroachments, including fill, unless it's been demonstrated through hydrologic and hydraulic analyses performed in accordance with standard engineering practice that the proposed encroachment would not result in any increase in flood levels. The language in the CFR is exactly the same as the language in the local code, and that's the standard that we're asking the board to assess this application on. Staff addressed the Willamette Greenway. That it's not under consideration as part of this application in any event, but the entire proposal sits outside of the Greenway. So that should not be relevant to today's decision. And again, the flood velocities, there was a lot of discussion of flood velocities. Those, again, are not part of today's decision. Those were considered when Yamhill County previously decided that this area was appropriate for gravel mining. It's zoned MR2. The county, through 3 separate ordinances and 2 trips to LUBA, has already made that determination. So the testimony stating that nobody thinks it's a good idea is simply not true. The county has already zoned the land for this use. What we're here for today is to discuss whether the proposed activity will result in any net rise in base flood elevation. And as established in the record and as testified by Mr. Lidstone, it does not. As to timing of the application, we also heard testimony that the county should put off a decision or just deny now and the applicant can come back later because it's inconvenient. The applicant gets to decide when to apply. The applicant has applied, submitted all necessary information for the county to decide, and the county has to make a decision, again, based on that information and the standards that are in place today. So if as a practical matter, if the county got into the habit of basically saying you have to have all other approvals beforehand, I mean, again, working with permitting at multi-jurisdictional levels doesn't work that way. It's sufficient under Oregon state law to put a condition on the permit that says you have to have all other approvals. So the timing shouldn't be a bar to making a decision on this permit application. Bear with me for just a moment here while I review my notes. The berms are largely a technical issue that Mr. Lidstone has addressed, but I would draw the county's attention to, and I don't have ordinance number 873 in front of me, but I believe it's condition number, it's within the first 10. Well, actually, I'm not sure. I'll pull up the reference, but essentially, the approval for the zoning states expressly that the intent of Baker Rock is to not ever have to build those berms. They're there for sound mitigation. And as Mr. Lidstone testified, the hope is that those berms will not be needed as sound mitigation in the future because there'll be technology in place to control backup beavers. It's condition number 21, noise mitigation. So, I mean, the berms are there if needed. And by providing the breaks in the berms, there shouldn't be any redirection in flow. But again, the intent is that when those are needed, and they're only needed as you move, I believe, northwest through those cells, there'll be less need for the berms. And that's a trend in the gravel mining industry. Everybody's trying to use methods for blasting and daily use that really mitigate sound. There's no blasting, excuse me, but it's still a trend. Everybody's trying to lower their noise impact. So, unless you have any questions, I think that those are all the comments I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Well, it has been
I have a question.
a long morning. Oh, question, I'm sorry.
Quick question, and I'm going to make this brief, because I think you answered all of the ones, Mr. Lidstone, that I had regarding the reclamation plan and things like that. Counselor, you mentioned that the bottom line is that what we're tasked with is to determine whether or not we believe there's no net increase in flood levels, and that we are told that it needs to be based on information that an engineer gives us, but we've got two engineers, Mr. Lidstone and Mr. Pune, and giving us an opinion on what I would assume would be an empirical science. So I'm kind of having a hard time figuring out how do you take what is empirical data and then say, and then extrapolate it two different ways. So it's kind of like a he said, she said on scientific data. So I don't know how we answer that question, and maybe you can answer since that's the requirement for us to make a decision.
Yeah. I'll take the first shot, and then certainly Phil can fill in. I'm not sure if and I have not reviewed, the first I've seen of his report is, Mr. Kuhn's report was today, so I've not reviewed his report in detail. But it's my understanding that he did not actually run a separate model. It's my understanding that his definition of the floodway that we saw in the PowerPoint is the same definition of floodway, floodplain, or flood-prone area as ours, which is FEMA has a definition of floodway versus floodplain. So I don't think the definitions are any different. I don't think Mr. Kuhn has actually done a model or has actually stamped a model of this particular area, so I don't think he's actually disagreeing necessarily with the model itself. He's asked some questions on procedural issues related to whether or not the model runs floodway versus floodplain analysis. Basically is I can present, and if we had a second submittal, we could certainly present that information. I don't think from the commissioner standpoint, there's actually two different models that are being presented to you.
Because didn't he say that he was using, in essence, the same model that you were using to come up with your conclusions?
I think he said that he would have used the same model. I don't think he actually did use a model that I know of.
Okay.
If so, it was not presented in that 3-page document.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just go back to the standard, and the standard is that the applicant has to demonstrate through hydrologic and hydraulic analyses performed in conformance with standard engineering practice that the proposal will not result in any increase in flood levels. So Mr. Lidstone's firm has done that. It's been completed by a professional engineer. The analysis is shown, and Mr. Pune's testimony is simply that testimony. He's commenting on what he believes about it, about that modeling effort, but he hasn't provided any alternative. He hasn't said that there will be a net increase. He's just provided testimony commenting on Mr. Lidstone's report. So the board gets to decide, but that's the status of the evidence.
Thank you. Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Commissioner Wilson?
No questions.
Okay. Well, as I started to say, this has been a long morning into the afternoon, and there's a couple of ways we can go. I know there was a request to keep the record open, as was pointed out by County Council. Since this is not the first hearing on this, we are under no obligation to do that. If I hear a motion, we can certainly discuss it. Aside from that, if we do not have a motion to keep the record open, I would, do we need to hear your?
You can hear the staff recommendation now, or if you decide to leave the record open, you can hear it at a later date when all the evidence is in.
Thank you, Ken. So we have a couple things. Number one, we have received a heck of a lot of testimony yesterday and today that I did review these. So I've gone through those. I have not gone through these. And I would certainly entertain a motion that we do close that we close to testimony and do a continuance of the hearing for 1 week, if it's okay with my fellow commissioners.
So moved.
So the hearing itself is closed. There will be no new testimony. We will take a 1 week continuance to allow us to review the testimony and the documents that were placed before us today, and the decision will be rendered at our meeting on the 9th. So could you put that in the form of a motion, please, Commissioner?
I have a question for
Yeah.
Counselor. Are we not required to allow there to be a rebuttal to the newly? No.
Not required. This is not the initial evidentiary hearing, so you don't need to leave the record open, and there doesn't need to be then, if you don't leave the record open to receive new testimony, then there's no need to leave the record open to rebut that new testimony. So what you would be doing today is basically continuing the hearing until next week, but you would be closing the hearing for any new testimony.
So I'll make a motion that we close today's hearing and that it will give us, for 7 days, give us a chance to look at the information and the testimony that came in last night and this morning, and then render a decision after hearing staff report at our next formal session on the 9th.
Yeah, so you would be closing the hearing and continuing it until Thursday, February 9th at 10 a.m. in room 32 at the point of staff recommendation.
Very good.
Correct.
So that is the motion. Any further discussion?
No.
Hearing none, I would call for the question. All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, same sign. So we will then continue the hearing until next Thursday at 10 a.m., this same room. And I certainly want to thank everybody who came out today to give testimony, and to the presentations were enlightening and massive. So I do definitely want to review this and thank all of you. With that, hearing nothing further, I will adjourn our, let me see, this is February already, 2nd, 2017 formal session.
No, you have to close the hearing.
Oh, I have.